The other aspect, which is what I do, or my team I should say do, is sitting here in Seattle, is we have a big focus on information and communication technology as well. So we are trying to bring, and in that sense we work across the organizations. Any microfinance organization in the world is essentially a potential client for us. And the things we do in that space, one of them is, how can you bring information and communication technology as a business opportunity for the poor entrepreneur themselves? And you probably heard about this, I'm not going to go into the details, but one of the things we do there is taking this idea that Yunus and Grameen Bank and Grameen Phone had in Bangladesh, which is to bring mobile telephony out to the villages. But for people who make $1 a day, they're not going to be able to afford their own device. As successful as that industry is, it still only reaches less than half of the world's population. But with a shared access model where one person takes out the loan and gets the equipment, the business in the box, they can resell airtime, and suddenly you have even people making $1 a day that for the first time in their life can have access to affordable telecommunications. So that's one type of business that we focus on, is how do you bring this technology that we take for granted in a financially sustainable way to people out in the villages. The other aspect we focus on is one of the stumbling blocks for microfinance to grow. There's a lot of them, but access to capital, of course, is a big one. But in order to grow and have access to capital, you've got to have good IT systems so you can track what is a very transaction-intensive business. And you just look at, some of these institutions have billions of transactions every year and without having that many clients. And part of that is because the loans are small, lots of people, and you repay usually on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. So you get a bunch of transactions. So as you guys know, working in this space, having a good database that can track that kind of stuff is frankly a must in order for the institution to know what's going on. Do you have a good portfolio? Are people paying back on what's going on, and how can you correct those problems? But it's also a way, if you have a good system, where you can start tracking some of the social impact that I talked about. So we spent a few years helping organizations implement solutions, realizing that there weren't a lot of good solutions out there. We actually went off and developed a solution. We outsourced a lot of the work to India, but the bottom line is we have a solution called MIFOS, which stands for Microfinance Open Source. And essentially what it is, it's a Java-based application. And I know this is not the right place to say that, but it's a Java-based application.
What's Java?
Yeah, okay. It's a software platform for microfinance. I realized I was going off on a deep end there. Runs on Windows, by the way, I should say. But basically, it's a browser-driven application that people can use in the field and connect into a database that can be hosted by somebody else or by the institution themselves. But it's trying to create a scalable and flexible solution so this institution can do that kind of scaling. So that's something we invested heavily in, and that a lot of people are picking up now, and a lot of institutions around the world are picking up, including large corporations that are looking at it as well. So we're trying to address some of the issues related to technology that can make sure that you can scale this industry further.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I had a couple of questions around the logistics of microfinance itself. I'm hoping somebody on this panel can answer. My first question was, what's the interest rate you charge on these microloans? And, these loans, as I understand, are given to entrepreneurs, and we know not all efforts are going to succeed. So what happens to people who start a business that doesn't work out? What happens in the case of default payments? And my second question was around, are poor children eligible to get microloans, or is it only focused on women?
So first, I'll just repeat the question. First question is around what's the interest rate that's charged and what happens to the people who default. And second question was around, is it just restricted to women, or other poor people, specifically children, can get the loans or not? Children, I would suggest, against child labor. Not to digress the question, but
solve the problem.
Yeah, but that's a fair question. Who would like to answer?
Sure, okay. I'll start with the first part. So interest rates vary by country generally, or by environment. One rule of thumb is well-run microfinance is often about the credit card. The interest rate people are paying is close to the credit card rate that a middle-class person pays in that country. And different countries, that's different interest rates. So in Latin America, it tends to be higher. In places like India, people would pay in the mid-20s for their credit card, as an example. And the question on defaults, so some people aren't entrepreneurial, couldn't pay things back. Another aspect of microfinance that's really results in such high repayment. And many programs that are run well have 99% or higher repayment. And I think most of our partners in that case, some are at 100%, basically. One of the reasons is that there's a lot of checks and balances that go into before a person is given a loan. Often it's a group around them, not even the person at the bank, the microfinance bank. That's to make sure that that loan is not too large for that person. So generally people start with fairly small loans that they can very easily, even if they don't run their business very well at all, they can make a return and pay that back. And then they graduate to bigger loans over time. So there's sort of a learning process, and that's how it results in that there's just very low defaults on microfinance.
Just say something about the interest rates. You have to kind of imagine a woman living in the countryside in Latin America who needs money for something. Where does she go to get money? She cannot walk into a bank and expect to borrow money. The only chance she has is from a friend, a family member, a neighbor, or a local money lender, somebody who specializes in lending money. Those money lending is very, very expensive. You're talking about if you're getting a $50 loan and you're paying it back next week, it'll be $55 when you pay it back next week. That's 10% during that week. So that's the alternative that has typically been available to people. In places where microfinance has not developed very, very much yet, a typical microfinance institution might charge between 50 and 100% a year. That's at the beginning, because the cost for them to get out to these places is high. The transactions are small, but also there's very little competition. And this is one of the reasons we need a lot more money coming into this business so that we can grow many more institutions and have much more competition. There was a famous case recently in Mexico, and the organization was charging around 80% a year. That won't happen very long. And one of the most developed markets in Latin America is Bolivia. And if you look at the interest rates in Bolivia, about 5 or 6 years ago, they were up around 40 or 50%. Now they're down in the low 20% range. And that's what we see happening all around the world.
Do you have criteria that you set on that? When you choose them, do you have criteria that you say, oh, that's too high, we're not going to invest in them in that particular institution?
We do look at what those interest rates are, but it varies from country to country. So in Mexico, I couldn't go into Mexico and say, well, you have to be charging 25%. In Bolivia, we would not invest in an organization that was charging as much as they are in Mexico today. So it varies, but we're in the business of trying to increase the competition in the industry so that interest rates can come down. And we would like to see our partners gradually moving their interest rates down as their costs come down.